Well, good evening. Good evening. Welcome, everybody, to another session with Mere Christianity. And just to remind everybody, in case I forget, the calendar this year, Easter being as early as it is, we are doing this in 2 5-week sessions. And this is week 5 of the first session. Then next week is Ash Wednesday. Next Wednesday is Ash Wednesday. And then over the next month, every other week, we have Ash Wednesday, Feed My Starving Children, Spring Break, Holy Week. and the idea was like we could only do Faithbreak like every other. I mean, it just was going to be so disjointed. We decided we're going to do 5 sessions uninterrupted, and then we're going to go have all those special things, and then we're going to do 5 more sessions uninterrupted. And we're a little over halfway through. If we get way ahead, I might have another brief C.S. Lewis thing. If we finish in the next 5, before the 5 are up, I have some other ideas. But we are ready to. If you have this book, if you bought the book that a lot of us have, we're up to page 94, which is about sexual morality. Didn't you want to hear about and talk about sexual morality on a Wednesday night? And I think that, as he has a chapter, or a brief chapter on sexual morality, followed by a chapter on Christian marriage. This is a middle-aged British professor who's single at the time, never married at the time, in the 1940s. So think about all those provisos, a never married, middle-aged British professor who is writing in the 1940s, really doing a radio broadcast really in wartime, and then he turns the radio broadcasts into this book after the war has concluded. Now, side note, C.S. Lewis did actually marry late in life, a woman named Joy Davidson, and the marriage was not very long because she got ill shortly after they were married, and they only had a few years before she passed away. I think it was cancer. I can't recall off the top of my head, but and he wrote a book called A Grief Observed after that, under a pseudonym. He wrote about grief after his brief marriage to this woman who they almost had very few years together, and then he had to watch her slowly die. And he wrote a book, but he didn't write it under his own name because he just felt it was so personal. And as he wrote it shortly after she died, and then people kept recommending he read it. You ought to read this book on grief. And then he finally he came out and admitted that he was the author, and now it's published under his name now. It's called A Grief Observed. But so he did marry, but not when he did these lectures, and not when he did this. So you think, well, what does he know? And he actually says that, of course. He says, what do I know? Or he doesn't say it quite that way, but he says, I realize I'm never married, and, he's a single person. But what he says, I think, still has a lot of merit, and I think, especially when you consider the time, it was written now, 80 years ago, and how much maybe culture has changed in 80 years. And he starts off there on page 94 making an interesting distinction, a couple of words that we maybe don't use a lot. He talks about chastity and modesty. Chastity and modesty. And he says the two are not really to be confused, chastity and modesty. He says modesty changes with culture. Matter of fact, about a third of the way down that page, on page 94, he says the rule of chastity is the same for all Christians at all times. The rule of propriety changes. And when he's talking about propriety, he's talking about what is modesty. And he goes on to say a Victorian woman in the Victorian age and a woman living on a Pacific island. The woman on the Pacific island might have very, very little clothing, and the Victorian woman might have a collar up to here and a dress down to her ankles. And he said, they would both perhaps be modest, because culturally what is called modesty changes and differs from culture to culture. He said one might be just equally chaste or equally unchaste as the other, just because culture changes. And we talk about what is modest in our culture. I know it's changed definitely in my lifetime, it kind of up and down in some ways. When I was in middle school, high school, girls' skirts were about as short as they could get. I mean, they were micro mini skirts back then, and they got longer for a while, and then they've gone up and down, and other things, bathing suits. What's considered a modest bathing suit? What was considered a modest bathing suit in the 1940s compared to now? Or what is modest? And it definitely changes culture to culture and era to era. So he says, don't confuse modesty with what he calls chastity. But we don't use the word chastity hardly anymore at all. I mean, that's not a word that you hear very often. No, sexual morality is a word that we can talk about. And he talks about if you break the laws of modesty, that's just bad manners. It would be like when we talk about, I mentioned on Sunday talking about hallowed be thy name. When you take the Lord's name in vain, that is breaking the third commandment. When you use certain vulgar curse words, that's just bad manners. If you're not talking about God, if you're just using vulgar words, that's just bad manners. I was brought up that if you use any curse word, you were somehow breaking the third commandment. No, that's about taking God's name in vain. The other is just bad manners and just being rude and vulgar. But so anyway, he's making this differentiation and talking about sexual morality, not modesty. In the little bit ways on 95, he says, at its present stage, which remember is the 1940s in England, at the present stage, however, it has this inconvenience. People of different ages and different types do not all acknowledge the same standard, and we hardly know where we are. Here he's still talking about what considered modesty. While this confusion lasts, I think that old-fashioned people should be very careful not to assume that young or emancipated people are corrupt whenever they are, by the old standard, improper, and in return, that young people should not call their elders prudes or Puritans because they do not easily adopt the new standard. And that's been going on as long as there have been people. If an older generation doesn't like a new style or standard of modesty, they're not necessarily right. And if a young person thinks an old person is a fuddy-duddy or a prude, they're not necessarily right either. But he goes on to say there in the first full paragraph on 95, chastity is the most unpopular of the Christian virtues. The most unpopular of the Christian virtues. And he says there's no getting away from it, because he lifts up the Christian virtue is marriage with complete faithfulness to your partner, or else total abstinence. That is the Christian standard. Sex is reserved for marriage. That is the Christian standard. And he says, this is so difficult and so contrary to our instincts that obviously either Christianity is wrong or our sexual instinct, as it now is, has gone wrong. One of these is wrong. And of course, he's going to fall on the side of Christianity. He thinks it's our instinct which has gone wrong. And, sociologists and all kinds of behavioral people will tell you that, wired into, especially men, is a biological thing. Men are wired to spread their seed to as many women as possible. And that goes back thousands of years. Men are wired to try to impregnate as many women as possible to increase their tribe, to increase their legacy. And so Christian the Christian morality in some ways is fighting that, as he says, is fighting our sexual instincts. But then he goes on at the bottom of 95 of why he thinks it is the instinct that's gone wrong, not Christian morality. The biological purpose of sex is children, just as the biological purpose of eating is to repair the body. He says, now, if you eat too much, you may eat a little bit too much, but not horrifically more. He says, one man may eat enough for 2, but he doesn't eat enough for 10. The appetite goes a little beyond its biological purpose, but not enormously. But if a healthy young man indulged his sexual appetite whenever he felt inclined, and if each act produced a baby, then in 10 years he might well populate a small village. The appetite is in ludicrous and preposterous excess of its function. So, and that's just biology. But then he goes about to say, he keeps comparing the human desire to eat to the human desire for sex. And then he says, what would you think if somebody came out on the stage with a meal under a cover, like, at a hotel, and they slowly reveal the meal for people applauding, and he's comparing it to a striptease, and the people would be, just waiting to see the whole food revealed from under the cover. And of course, he said that would be ludicrous. And then he goes on to say, but that, he's talking about the sexual morality of England in the 40s and how it's out of control, which we might think is cute and quaint now because of when we... Huh? Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't know that while I would say that was out of control, I might understand it in that context.
Mm-hmm.
Next week you might be dead.
Yeah, that's true. I remember reading in the history of World War I, so that's, that the French soldiers traveled with prostitutes. I mean, that was a part of the French army, was they had a group of prostitutes that went with them. And someone, when they found out that the Americans were working with the French in World War I, they said, President Wilson can't hear about that or he'll cancel the war. I mean, he and that was 100 years ago. European, we're talking about England here, which we tend to think of as stiff upper lip and, still Victorian and all very proper, but yeah. I mean, what is considered proper in different cultures, has a lot of waxing and waning to it. But he talks about, a striptease of food would be a rather strange thing. In middle of page 97, he talks about contraceptives, which, of course, this is still before the invention of the birth control pill. This is the 1940s. This is before the pill. Contraceptives have made sexual indulgence far less costly within marriage and far safer outside of it than ever before. And public opinion is less hostile to illicit unions and even to perversion than it has been since pagan times. Nor is the hypothesis of starvation the only one we can imagine. Everyone knows that the sexual appetite, like our other appetites, grows by indulgence. Starving men may think much about food, but so do gluttons. The gorged as well as the famished like titillations. Then he goes on, and thankfully he doesn't go into any detail, but he talks about perversions of sex are numerous. And again, we might think you ain't seen nothing yet to that. For the last 20 years, so he's talking about from the 1920s to the present, there towards the bottom, and I, for the last 20 years, have been fed all day long on good, solid lies about sex. We've been told, till one is sick of hearing it, that sexual desire is in the same state as any of the other natural desires, and if only we abandon the silly old Victorian idea of hushing it up, everything in the garden will be lovely. The moment you look at the facts and away from the propaganda, you see it is not. And then he talks about how, again, this is a lot and somewhat dated, but how much is sex part of polite conversation or out in the open. And he says there, modern people are always saying sex is nothing to be ashamed of. They may mean two things. They may mean there's nothing to be ashamed of in the fact that the human race reproduces itself in a certain way, nor in the fact that it gives pleasure. If they mean that, they're right. Christianity says the same. It's not the thing or the pleasure that's the trouble. The old Christian teachers said that if man had never fallen, sexual pleasure, instead of being less than it is now, would have been greater. I know, this is, I think, a really important sentence. I know some muddle-headed Christians have talked as if Christianity thought that sex or the body or pleasure was bad in themselves. They were wrong. And without going too far away from C.S. Lewis here, historically, there's all kinds of reasons for all kinds of ways that the church and Christianity and church, theologians and preachers and everybody else has talked about this. And, one of the historical things that it goes back to is St. Augustine. And I may have mentioned that before. St. Augustine. Augustine, or Augustine, was a lay person in the late 300s, early 400s. And his mother was a Christian, but he was not. He was a brilliant guy, but he and his mother wanted him so badly to embrace Christianity, but he did not, because he loved a libertine lifestyle. He loved to sleep around. He loved to have sex with a lot of different women, and he lived that lifestyle. And his mother continued to pray for him, beg him to, come to Christ. And for 20 years, he, rejected that. But he was a brilliant guy, a philosophical guy, looked at lots of different world religions. And I won't go into all of his life, all of his biography, but he did one day read the New Testament, read the Bible, and begin to accept and finally embrace Christianity. And he became not just a Christian, he became a priest and then a bishop and then one of the leading Christian writers and theologians of the early times, of the 3rd and 4th centuries. And I would not be saying anything that every other theologian doesn't say, is that outside of the biblical writers themselves, outside of the New Testament authors themselves, Augustine has had more influence on Christianity than any other writer ever. And especially on the Roman Catholic Church. And Augustine, when he became a Christian, looked back on his former life with horror, and especially his sexual exploits. And so his theological writings have a very negative view of sex. And that influenced all kinds of things, especially in the Roman Catholic Church, but in Christianity in lots of ways. Augustine's writings and Augustine's influence is felt in lots of places. It's felt in the celibacy of priests. Priests weren't celibate for the first 300 years. It was only really in the 4th century that the church began to demand that priests be celibate. The Roman Catholic prohibition of artificial birth control really goes back to Augustine, because Augustine argued that the only reason for sex is to create children. That's the only reason people, and if you're not at least, there's not at least a chance there will be a child, then you are, stepping into a dangerous territory if you are only looking for pleasure in sex. And that, his viewpoint, Augustine's viewpoint, his negative attitude towards sex, you can trace the celibacy of priests, the prohibition against artificial birth control, and all kinds of really writings that somehow make the sin of Adam and Eve somehow tied up with sex somehow. There are people who somehow think the Adam and Eve story is somehow negative about sex because they're naked, or it's nothing about it that's like that. But anyway, all that to say, there has been what you might call a puritanical influence in Christianity about sexuality. The flip side of that is the culture has gone amazing 100 miles the other direction, as if to say, yeah, it's just like, I need a cheeseburger, I need sex. It's purely it's just a biological need that has no significance other than purely pleasure. And these two worldviews clash. So when Lewis is saying, he's saying, sex is nothing to be ashamed of. He says, if you're talking about, God's the one who thought it up. God's the one who created this as the method for producing children. God thought sex up. So he says, if you're saying there's nothing to be ashamed of, he says, you're right. He says at the bottom of 98, if anyone says that sex in itself is bad, Christianity contradicts him at once. But of course, when people say sex is nothing to be ashamed of, they may mean the state into which the sexual instinct has now got is nothing to be ashamed of. If they mean that, they are wrong. I think it's everything to be ashamed of. There's nothing to be ashamed of in enjoying your food. There would be everything to be ashamed of if half the world made food their main interest of their lives and spent their time looking at pictures of food and dribbling and smacking their lips. And in other words, and remember, this is the 40s, and I realize, people weren't as buttoned down as in the 40s as maybe we think they were. I think you're right about that. But he is talking about, he says, we're surrounded by propaganda in favor of unchastity. And if they're surrounded by propaganda in favor of unchastity, in other words, sexuality sort of removed from its mooring of marriage and family. If it was being surrounded by propaganda in the 1940s, what is it now? He says the people who want to keep our sex instinct inflamed in order to make money out of us. Did you know that the pornography industry makes more money than the NFL, Major League Baseball, the NBA, the NHL, all professional sports things combined? Pornography produces more money than every professional sports franchise combined. Talk about making money off of, and, so he's arguing for what he calls chastity, a sexual morality. He says, a famous Christian long ago, he's talking about St. Augustine, okay? He's not wanting to muddle his audience by doing what I just did, which is going down a rabbit trail about St. Augustine. When he says, a famous Christian long ago told us that when he was a young man, he prayed continually for chastity. But years later, he realized that while his lips had been saying, "Oh, Lord, make me chaste," his heart had secretly been adding, "But please don't do it just yet." So So even when he was in the middle of his wild days, he felt a certain guilt over it. But that quote, "but not now," is in a book of St. Augustine's called Confessions. He says, there are 3 reasons why it is now difficult for us to desire, let alone achieve, chastity. He's like, first, there's the temptation, he says, from the culture, and he talks about, poster after poster, film after film, novel after novel, associate the idea of sexual indulgence with the ideas of health, normality, youth, frankness, and good humor, and he's saying this is all lies. He says, if you surrender to all your desires, that leads to impotence, disease, jealousy, lies, concealment, and everything that is the reverse of health, good humor, and frankness. Then he says the second thing on top of 101, the second reason people are deterred from attempting chastity is because they think it's impossible. They just say, well, that's impossible. And he just says that's a very imperfect answer because, he says it's amazing what you can do when you have to do, when you have to. And he, talking especially even, there are a lot of things that you say, well, that's impossible. But somehow, he says, remember in wartime, you say, well, there's a lot of things that you thought were impossible in wartime that somehow we've done. So saying it's impossible. And then thirdly, on the top of 102, third, people misunderstand what psychology teaches about repressions. I guess modern or current psychology of the day in the 40s was talking about, you're repressing your urges, you're repressing your need, you're repressed. And he basically says that's he's talking about how they say, you're repressed, middle of that paragraph. On the contrary, those who are seriously attempting chastity are more conscious and soon know a great deal more about their own sexuality than anyone else. They come to know their desires as Wellington knew Napoleon, or a Sherlock Holmes knew Moriarty, as a rat catcher knows rats, or a plumber knows leaky pipes. Virtue, even attempted virtue, brings light. Indulgence brings fog. And then I really think his last paragraph is really good and funny. Finally, and kind of like, good, this chapter is one that maybe, finally, though I've had to speak at some length about sex, I want to make it clear as I possibly can that the center of Christian morality is not here. If anyone thinks that Christians regard unchastity as the supreme vice, he's quite wrong. The sins of the flesh are bad, but they are the least bad of all sins. The sins of the flesh are bad, but they're the least bad of all sins. All the worst pleasures are purely spiritual. The pleasure of putting other people in the wrong, of bossing and patronizing and spoiling sport and backbiting, the pleasures of power, of hatred. He's saying all these things are much worse than the so-called sins of the flesh. All those things are much worse. He says, there are 2 things inside me, competing with the human self, which I must try to become. They are the animal self, which is where some of these desires come from, and the diabolical self. The diabolical self is the worst of the 2. And so the diabolical self is where the people who get pleasure out of putting other people down, bossing, patronizing, backbiting, all that. He says those are the diabolical sins as opposed to the what he would call the animal sins. And he says the diabolical self is the worst of the 2. That is why a cold, self-righteous prig who goes regularly to church may be far nearer to hell than a prostitute. But of course, it's better to be neither. So he's like, the person who is mean, who hurts other people, he says, that is much worse than somebody who gives in to this, desire. Now he says both of them are bad. He just says one of them is much worse. And the one that's much worse is the one that is out to hurt people. He says that's a lot worse than the sins of the flesh. So I just think he says it's better not to be either one of those things. Which leads him to another chapter of which he right off the bat, of course, says, he gives right up front talking about Christian marriage, and he says up front, of course, he's a single man. He's never been married. He says, I think the second or third sentence, there are two reasons why I don't particularly want to deal with marriage. The first is that the Christian doctrines on this subject are extremely unpopular. And the second is I've never been married myself, and therefore can speak only at second hand. But in spite of that, I feel I can hardly leave the subject out in account of Christian morals. He is basically, again, saying, what does Jesus say about marriage? Two people become one flesh. The two become one flesh. He says that God has created us, male and female. We were made for each other. And he's not talking just, about sex. He's talking about everything that the male and the female bring together. The last sentence on the bottom of 104. The monstrosity of sexual intercourse outside of marriage is that those who indulge in it are trying to isolate one kind of union, the sexual, from all the other kinds of union which were intended to go along with it and make up the total union. In other words, he's basically saying adultery, or even, sex outside of marriage, is taking one aspect of marriage and separating it from all the other parts of marriage. And again, he wants to make sure he's not saying anything wrong with sex. The Christian attitude doesn't mean that there's anything wrong about sexual pleasure any more than the pleasure of eating. It means that you must not isolate that pleasure and try to get it by itself any more than you ought to get the pleasure of taste without swallowing and digesting, by chewing things and spitting them out. He's just saying to separate sex from marriage is to take something that is meant to be a part of this spiritual union and taking it outside of that. And then he tackles, again, he says, and remember, he's saying he's trying not to side with any one denomination, about churches that completely don't allow divorce at all, and those that admit it, he says, in special cases. Well, that is quite different in our culture now, although at least in theory, in the Roman Catholic Church, divorced people cannot be married in the church unless they annul the first wedding, and there's all kinds of hoops to jump through for divorced people to get married in the Roman Catholic Church. I think a lot of those priests have loosened those things a lot, this is in the 1940s. It was more difficult in the church to get church approval for a divorce. He says, it's a great pity that Christians should disagree about such a question, but for an ordinary layman, the thing to notice is that the churches all agree with one another about marriage a great deal more than any of them did agree with the outside world. They all regard divorce as something like cutting up a living body, as a kind of surgical operation. Some of them think the operation is so violent it can't be done at all. Others admit it's a desperate remedy in extreme cases. But they all agree that it's more like having your legs cut off than it is like dissolving a business partnership. I've often counseled couples, especially, in bad situations, that divorce is never a good thing. It's just sometimes the better of some not good options. Sometimes divorce is the best option of 2 or 3 not great options. And I've, not that especially in my earlier days as a pastor, a lot of people would come to me thinking about divorce, especially women who were in abusive situations. And it was like they were wanting me to give them permission. I think they're really wanting God to give them permission. And they were looking for me to say, it's okay. And I would often say, divorce is not something Jesus celebrates, but it is something I think the church realizes is a reality, because sometimes marriages are not working, and there's pain, and there's suffering, and there's abuse, and there's all kinds of things. And sometimes it's the better of some bad options. But he's just saying, comparing that to the culture, saying at the bottom of that paragraph, what they all disagree with is the modern view that it's a simple readjustment of partners to be made whenever people feel they're no longer in love with one another, or when either of them falls in love with someone else. And he, of course, he's going to go on to say that, saying, well, I don't feel like I'm in love anymore. He's going to go on to say that the feeling of being in love is not the most important part of marriage, that romance can fade. It almost always does, but that it's more about commitment than it is about romance. And then he just says, and again, this almost sounds very much less relevant than it is now. He's talking about people getting married in the church. In the last 10 years, the number of weddings I've done in this room, 5, 6, maybe. 20, 30 years ago, I would do 10, 12, 15 weddings a year. Now, 1 or 2. Now, I'm not counting the ones where a couple late in life or marrying somebody and it's a second marriage and it's just me and the couple in the chapel. I've done a handful of those. But in terms of an actual wedding with the dress, the groomsmen, the brides, the flowers, the whole shebang, I think in the last 10 years, 4 or 5. And in the last 15 years, maybe 6 or 7, and 3 of those were my own kids. The vast majority of people are not getting married in the church anymore. The vast majority of people now are getting married at venues. And most of them don't ask a pastor to do it. They have an uncle, a friend, somebody else do the ceremony. It's a huge shift in our culture. But it's not just our church. I talk to other pastors, and they all say the same thing. So he's talking about marriage in the church as opposed to secular marriage at the courthouse, kind of thing. But back in the 1940s, those were kind of your 2 choices. It's either you get married in a church by a pastor or you go to the courthouse and get married by the justice of the peace. Now, the laws are such that even in states that require somebody to be, quote, ordained, you can be ordained on the internet in 30 minutes into the Church of Eternal Sunshine or whatever, And they'll print you out a ordination certificate, for Uncle Joe who's going to do the wedding. So some of this is not the way it is now, So, he's talking about why do people get married in the church if they don't intend to stay married? There on page 106. Someone may reply, that he regarded the promise made in church as a mere formality that he never intended to keep. And sadly, I'm sure that's true too. Some people don't take vows seriously at all anymore. I don't know if a lot of people know what a vow really even is anymore. That it's that you're making something more than just going, yeah, sure. But he's saying if you enter into a marriage thinking, yeah, well, if it doesn't work, I'll just, if you enter into it with one foot out the door already, he says, so whom then was he trying to deceive when he made it, when he's making the vows in the church when he doesn't really intend to keep them? God? That was very unwise. Himself? That was not very much wiser. The bride? The bridegroom? Or the in-laws? That was treacherous. More often, I think the couple, one of them, hoped to deceive the public. They wanted the respectability that is attached to marriage without intending to pay the price. That is, they were imposters. They cheated. If they're still contented cheats, I have nothing to say to them. Who would urge the high and hard duty of chastity on people who have not yet wished to be merely honest? If they've now come to their senses and want to be honest, their promise already made constrains them. And this, you'll see, comes under the heading of justice, not that of chastity. If people don't believe in permanent marriage, it's perhaps better that they should just live together unmarried than that they should make vows that they don't mean to keep. There he's being almost prophetic without realizing it. People living together outside of marriage in the 1940s was scandalous. Now it's incredibly common. I mean, it's extremely common. So this is one of the chapters that you really have to kind of take in historical context, that the reality of Great Britain in the 40s is very different from the reality of Western Europe or the U.S. in the 20s. But then he does go on to say some things that I think are true all the time about how people who give up on marriage, and again, I would say there's some good reasons to give up on a marriage: abuse, addiction, infidelity. There's all kinds of reasons that I think make sense for a couple to divorce. But he goes on to say some people just say, well, I'm not in love anymore, so I'm going to just move on to somebody else. And he just says there, bottom of 108, no feeling, he's talking about the feeling that you feel, the infatuation that you feel when you first date somebody, fall in love with somebody. No feeling can be relied on to last its full intensity or even to last at all. Knowledge can last. Principles can last. Habits can last. Feelings come and go. In fact, whenever people say the state called being in love usually does not last. If the old fairy tale ending, and they lived happily ever after, is taken to mean they felt for the next 50 years exactly as they felt the day before they were married, then it says what probably never was nor ever would be true, and would be highly undesirable if it were. Who could bear to live in that excitement for even 5 years? What would become of your work, your appetite, your sleep, your friendship? But of course, ceasing to be in love need not mean ceasing to love. Love in this second sense, love as distinct from being in love, is not merely a feeling. It's a deep unity, maintained by the will and deliberately strengthened by habit, reinforced by, in Christian marriage, the grace which both partners ask to receive from God. They can have this love for each other even at those moments when they don't like each other. As you love yourself when you don't like yourself. They can retain this love even when each would easily say if they allowed themselves to be in love with someone else. Being in love first moved them to promise fidelity. This quieter love enables them to keep the promise. It's on this love that the engine of marriage is run. Being in love was the explosion that started it. And as I say, I mean, I think I think he's a little more harsh than I am because he's of a different generation, because I see often divorce as the better than staying married for some couples. I just think that sometimes is what is necessary. And I just think that sometimes that's what needs to happen. So I think I'm a little less, I think I'm not in total agreement with him here on some of what he's saying. But I do agree that, yeah, the love that keeps the marriage going is not infatuation. It's not that the infatuation that you feel early on in a relationship is not going to stay at that level forever. It's just not. At least, I don't know of any couple that would say that, because you mature and things are different, and the love a couple or a friendship or any other thing is not at the level when it starts. And then he goes on to say, kind of like the same way, he says in other departments, thrills at the beginning don't last. He says the first time a boy flies in an airplane, it's a thrill. If you have a job where you fly once a week, it's not a thrill anymore. If you visit Hawaii for the first time, you're like, wow. If you move to Hawaii, after a while, it's not a thrill anymore. That's where he compares marriage. It's, these things that are thrilling at the beginning are not going to stay thrilling for 50 years, but they're not meant to. Matter of fact, he says on 111, talking about the thrill, people expecting the thrill that they felt when they first met or started dating. Middle of 111. If you decide to make thrills your regular diet and try to prolong them artificially, they'll all get weaker and weaker and fewer, and you'll be a bored, disillusioned old man for the rest of your life. It's because so few people understand this that you find many middle-aged men and women maundering about their lost youth at the very age when new horizons ought to be appearing and new doors opening all around them. It is much better fun to learn to swim than to go on endlessly and hopelessly trying to get back the feeling you had when you first went paddling as a small boy. You realize that if you're always chasing thrills, it's going to get weaker and weaker. And that it's the way it is, sadly, and he's not talking about this, but my experience has been in counseling people and knowing people is that a lot of things that become addictive, you kind of have to keep heightening the dosage to try to get the same effect. Whether it's pornography, whether it's drugs, whether it's alcohol, whether it's gambling, whether it's whatever it is, things that are addictive. This was the baseline. Well, that doesn't get me the thrill or the excitement that it got. I've got to go to the next level and the next level and the next level, and you get diminishing returns. And then it just goes about how, people who, quote, fall in love, and have an affair, and it, usually doesn't work out. Now, again, something that does kind of impact our day. He says, before leaving the idea of divorce on page 112, before leaving the question, I should like to discuss two things which are very often confused. The Christian conception of marriage is one. The other is quite different opinion. How far Christians, if they're voters or members of parliament, ought to try to force their views of marriage on the rest of the community by embodying them in divorce laws. A great many people seem to think that if you're a Christian yourself, you should try to make divorce difficult for everyone. I don't think that. At least I know I would be very angry if the Mohammedans, in other words, the Muslims, tried to prevent the rest of us from drinking wine. My own view is that the churches should frankly recognize that the majority of British people are not Christians and therefore cannot be expected to live Christian lives. There ought to be two distinct kinds of marriage, one governed by the state with rules enforced on all citizens, the other governed by the church with rules enforced by her on her own members. The distinction ought to be quite sharp, so that a man knows which couples are married in a Christian sense and which are not. And that does apply. He's saying, of course, in his day, if somebody was in Parliament and they went through a divorce, someone might say, oh, that person can't be a member of Parliament if they've been divorced. Well, that, in terms of our elected officials, I think that ship has sailed pretty far away by now. We know that adultery is no longer a problem for elected officials now, both Democrat and Republican. We don't seem to hold that, at least, and legally, adultery is immoral, but it's not illegal. Huh? Well, yeah, lawyer here. Okay, it can be. Can adultery be illegal?
It can be. But what's more interesting is that Oklahoma laws have changed since I first went to law school. When there were only 7 reasons you could get divorced, we were not a no-fault jurisdiction when I first went to law school, and now we are a no-fault jurisdiction. You don't have to lay out immorality, non-support, et cetera, et cetera. But there are only 7 reasons for most of the state's history that you can get divorced.
One of them being adultery, but adultery still was never illegal in and of itself, right? I mean, I don't know that. I'm guessing. Well,
That ship has sailed too.
yeah. Well, one of the, again, it's a slight rabbit trail, but one of the reasons I continue to be very grateful that we chose and voted to disaffiliate from the United Methodist Church is after churches like ours, 7,000 churches left, and they had their general conference after we all left. There are standards for clergy and things that are called a chargeable offense for a pastor. Things that if you commit this, you can be brought up in charges by the board of ministry. They removed adultery as one of those charges. After we left, adultery is no longer listed as a chargeable offense for a United Methodist clergyman. Another good reason to have left. I mean, and I don't know how they tried to work or explain that or justify that. But again, I'm thankful every day we decided, and I wish, I served as a pastor in that denomination for 38 years. It breaks my heart continually, but we did the right thing very clearly. Anyway, the last part is, again, a little bit of its time. He's dealing with the scripture that talks about, is the man the head of the family, and he doesn't spend much time on it other than to say, well, there has to be a tiebreaker somewhere. And he uses more sociological reasons than he does, I think, biblical reasons. But let's go to the next part. Let's see if we can cover forgiveness in our time left this evening. He says, I said in the previous chapter that chastity was the most unpopular of the Christian virtues. I'm not sure I was right. I believe there's one that's even more unpopular. It's laid down in the Christian rule, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Because in Christian morals, thy neighbor includes thy enemy, and we come up against this terrible duty of forgiving our enemies. So he's saying, even more unpopular, the idea of chastity, even worse, is us having to forgive people. He says that's even more unpopular, having to forgive people. He, he says, everyone says forgiveness is a lovely idea until they have something to forgive. And then he's talking about right after the war and how people, he said, remember, historical context, the war has just ended when he's writing the book. He's in the middle of the war when he actually is doing some of the lectures. Everyone says forgiveness is a lovely idea until they have something to forgive, as we had during the war. And then to mention the subject, allows to be greeted with howls of anger. It's not that people think this too high and difficult a virtue. It's that they think it hateful and contemptible. Quote, that sort of talk makes them sick, they say. Half of you already want to ask me, I wonder how you'd feel about forgiving the Gestapo if you were a Pole or a Jew. And that is a potent argument. Those of us that went on 2 mission trips to Poland, we visited Auschwitz. Does everybody know what Auschwitz was? Auschwitz is where they brought the Jewish people in on a train and took them into a big room, gassed them to death, and then incinerated them. I mean, it was Hitler's final solution. And, it was done with German efficiency. And it's in Poland. The Auschwitz is in Poland, but the Polish people, especially if you visit Auschwitz in Poland, they are very particular. You say, this is this Polish concentration camp. No. It was not a Polish concentration camp. It was a German Nazi concentration camp that was located in Poland. It was the Nazis exterminating the Jews. And if you ever get a chance, I never thought until we went, I'd go to Poland. You don't just I think I'll go to Poland. But until we had the chance to go there a couple of times with a mission trip. So I'd heard of Auschwitz and I'd seen, Schindler's List and all these things. But to actually go to Auschwitz and see, because they have it preserved, to see where they collected the suitcases and the shoes and the gold from the teeth and all the things that they got out of the Jews before they exterminated them. It's unfathomable that still less than 100 years ago that one group of humans could do that to another group of humans. It's just So to talk about forgiveness, you say, if you mention forgiveness right after World War II, people are going to go, are you insane? So he goes on to say, he says, and he's basically saying, yes, I get it. I wonder very much, just as when Christianity tells me that I must not deny my religion, even to save myself from death by torture. I wonder very much what I should do when it came to that point. I'm not trying to tell you this. I'm not trying to tell you in this book what I could do. I can do precious little. I'm telling you what Christianity is. I didn't invent it. He's saying, this is not C.S. Lewis' idea. He says this is Jesus' idea, forgiving people. He says, I didn't invent this. Jesus invented this. And there, right in the middle of it, I find forgive us our sins as we forgive those that sin against us. There is no slightest suggestion that we are offered forgiveness on any other term. It's made perfectly clear that if we don't forgive, we shall not be forgiven. There's no two ways about it. What are we to do? And he said, it's going to be hard enough. I think there's 2 things we can do to make it easier. When you start mathematics, you don't begin with calculus. You begin with simple addition. In the same way, if we really want, but all depends on really wanting. If you really want to learn how to forgive, maybe we'd better start with something easier than the Gestapo. Maybe that's not where we start, is with the Gestapo. One might start by forgiving one's husband or wife or parent or children or the nearest NCO. That's non-commissioned officer, I'm guessing, for something they have done or said in the last week. That will probably keep us busy for the moment. And secondly, we might try to understand exactly what loving your neighbor as yourself exactly means. I have to love him as I love myself. Well, how exactly do I love myself? And then I'm not going to read all that, but he basically says there's a lot of times I don't love myself at all. And he goes on to say, I think this is just a funny paragraph. I think I'm going to read it. When I come to think of it, I have not exactly got a feeling of fondness or affection for myself. I don't even enjoy my own society. So apparently love your neighbor doesn't mean feel fond for him or find him attractive. I'd have seen that before because, of course, you can't feel fond of a person by trying. Do I think well of myself, think myself a nice chap? Well, I'm afraid I sometimes do, and those are no doubt my worst moments. But that is not why I love myself. In fact, it is the other way around. My self-love makes me think myself nice, but thinking myself nice is not why I love myself. So loving my enemies does not apparently mean thinking them nice. That's an enormous relief. For a good many people imagine that forgiving your enemies means making out that they're really not such bad fellows after all, which is quite plain that they are. Go a step further. In my most clear-headed moments, not only do I not think myself a nice man, I know that I'm a very nasty man. I can look at some things I've done with horror and loathing. So apparently I'm allowed to loathe and hate some of the things my enemies do. Now that I come to think of it, I remember Christian teachers telling me long ago that I must hate a man's bad actions, but not hate the bad man, or as some would say, hate the sin and not the sinner. And he just reaffirms what we all know, what I've learned and said and preached, and you cannot command anybody how to feel. When you say we need to forgive, it doesn't mean, I've got for my enemy or the person who's hurt me, I have these warm, fuzzy feelings for them. No, you cannot tell anybody how to feel. You can't force anybody how to feel. You can only tell people how to act. So forgiving somebody does not mean you like them. It just means you treat them with love and not fuzzy affection, rainbow flowers and hearts love, the kind of love that is this agape love that Paul talks about, which is purely an act of the will. It's purely how you treat somebody. It's not how you feel about them. It's purely how you treat them. So loving your enemy, if you use that, remember the Greeks had all these different words for love. We have this one word, and the Greeks had all these different words for love. But agape, the word that Paul uses, the word that Jesus uses, loving your enemy or loving your neighbor is all about how you treat him. None of it's about your feelings. Because even Jesus can't command you how to feel. Nobody can command you how to feel. I can't say, feel sad, feel happy, feel excited. You can't do that. It's always about actions. And he just talks about how he doesn't always like himself. And he then goes on, middle of the next paragraph. Just because I loved myself, I was sorry to find that I was the sort of man who did those things. He's talking about some of his own failures. Consequently, Christianity does not want us to reduce by one atom the hatred we feel for cruelty and treachery. We hate cruelty. We hate treachery. We ought to hate them. Not one word of what we've said about them needs to be unsaid. But it does want us to hate them in the same way in which we hate things in ourselves, being sorry that the man should have done such things, hoping, if it's possible, that somehow, sometime, somewhere, he can be cured and made human again. It's an act of the will. And then he goes on to say some things that are kind of surprising. Middle of 118, he says, does loving your enemy mean not punishing him? No. For loving myself doesn't mean that I ought to not subject myself to punishment, even to death. If you'd committed a murder, the right Christian thing to do would be to give yourself up to the police and be hanged. My opinion, it's perfectly right for a Christian judge to sentence a man to death or a Christian soldier to kill an enemy. I mean, he's not saying that anything has to do with punishment. He says that's a matter of justice. And then he says, I've always thought so. Ever since I became a Christian and long before the war. I still think so now that we're at peace. It's no good quoting thou shalt not kill. There are two Greek words, the ordinary word to kill and the one to murder. And when Christ quotes the commandment, he uses the murder one in all three accounts, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I'm told there's the same distinction in Hebrew. All killing is not murder any more than all sexual intercourse is adultery. He says, when soldiers came to St. John, or John the Baptist, he never suggested they should leave the army, nor did Christ when he met a centurion. He basically says, I can respect a pacifist, but I disagree with them. And he says something that I find kind of there in the middle of 119. He says, I've often thought to myself how it would have been, because he served in World War I. Lewis served in World War I. He says, I often thought how it would have been if, when I served in the First World War, I and some young German had killed each other simultaneously and found ourselves together a moment after death. I can't imagine that either of us would have felt any resentment or even any embarrassment. I think we might have laughed over it. So he's imagining a Christian German soldier and himself simultaneously shooting each other, finding themselves in heaven, and then going, well, that was fun, or something. That was funny. So he doesn't see any problem with capital punishment. He doesn't see any problem with just war. He doesn't see any problem with serving in the military. So none of those, he says, impinge or change the commandment to, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Forgive us our sins as we have forgiven those who sin against us. So he says at the bottom of 119. So I imagine somebody will say, well, if one's allowed to condemn the enemy's acts and punish him and kill him, what difference is left between the Christian morality and the ordinary view? All the difference in the world. Remember, we Christians think man lives forever. In other words, we are eternal beings. We will live together either in God's presence or outside of God's presence. Therefore, what really matters is those little marks or twists on the central inside part of the soul that are going to turn it in the long run into a heavenly or hellish creature. We may kill if necessary, but we must not hate and enjoy hating. We may punish if necessary, but we must not enjoy it. In other words, something inside us, the feeling of resentment, the feeling that wants to get one's own back, in other words, revenge, must simply be killed. I don't mean that anyone can decide this moment that he'll never feel it anymore. That's not how things happen. I mean that every time it bobs its head up, this feeling like I'm going to enjoy killing this person. I'm going to enjoy watching this person hang or whatever. Every time that feeling bobs its head up, day after day, year after year, all our lives long, we must hit it on the head. It's hard work, but the attempt is not impossible. Even when we kill and punish, we must try to feel about the enemy as we feel about ourselves, to wish that he were not bad, to hope that he may, in this world or another, be cured. In fact, to wish him good. That's what's meant in the Bible by loving him, wishing him good, not feeling fond of him or saying he's nice when he's not. So again, loving someone who has hurt you, somebody that you would call an enemy, is not about liking them, not about having fond feelings about them, not saying, well, they're really a pretty nice person when they're not. They may be a horrible person. But not falling into hatred, not enjoying their misery if they're punished. And I think to give up hatred. It sounds like I'm about spent my voice, I think. So, sorry, excuse me. Oh, okay. Let's look at the very end of that section. It says, I admit this means loving people who have nothing lovable about them. But then, has oneself anything lovable about it? You love it simply because it is yourself. God intends us to love all selves in the same way and for the same reasons. But He's given us the sum ready worked out in our own case and show us how it works. We have to then go on and supply the rule to all the other selves. Perhaps it makes it easier if we remember that is how He loves us, not for any nice, attractive qualities we think we have, but just because we are the things called selves. He just loves us because that's who He is. There's nothing else for us to do, us to love. Creatures like us who actually find hatred such a pleasure, and that to give up hating, is like giving up beer or tobacco. So, those three sections, chastity, marriage, and then forgiveness. But look what the title of the next one is. The Great Sin. The one that's the root of all sin is the next part. If you've read ahead, you know what it is. And maybe you would be able to guess it even if you weren't. The root of all sin is pride. So that's where we'll end. Let's pray. Lord, help us as we imperfect people, help us to be more like you each day. Move a little closer to who you want us to be. Lord, we're all imperfect, and we want to be more like you. We lift up our prayers to you and ask you to bless our families and friends, and go with us now. Amen. All right, so next Wednesday, remember, is Ash Wednesday. So we invite you to be here. That's at 6:30, the Ash Wednesday service. Okay.